Chapter 1, 10 July 1923, Tuesday, the Savoy Hotel, London. We begin at the height of Marguerite Alibert's apparent triumph, introducing her as Princess Fami in the marble corridors of London's most prestigious hotel. Once a girl from the Paris slums, she now wears silk and diamonds, yet the wealth surrounding her belongs entirely to her husband, Prince Ali Fami. The chapter establishes the fundamental paradox of her existence, a woman who appears to have everything, yet owns nothing. Through vivid descriptions of the Savoy's opulence and glimpses into Marguerite's past, we see how she transformed herself from Marie, a coachman's daughter, into one of Paris's most sought-after courtesans. Her relationships with powerful men, including hints of royal connections, laid the foundation for this pinnacle moment. Yet beneath the glamour lies the invisible legacy that truly shaped her: brutal poverty, survival through beauty and cunning, and the private knowledge that influence, not love, is the real currency of the wealthy. The tone is deliberately opulent yet hollow, creating a sense of foreboding. As she prepares for what will become the most notorious night of her life, we glimpse the question that has driven her entire existence. How far will she go to never be powerless again? The carpets at the Savoy swallowed sound completely. That was what Marguerite noticed first about this kind of wealth. Even footsteps were not permitted to disturb the carefully orchestrated silence of privilege. She moved through the corridor like a woman underwater, her white satin evening gown flowing around her hips, emeralds cool against her throat despite the July heat. Behind her, a uniformed maid hurried with a fur wrap, though the summer evening hardly required it. Ahead, a waiter paused mid-stride, spine curving in practiced deference. To the staff, she was Madame la Princesse. To the guests half hidden behind their evening papers and cigarette smoke, she was the latest scandalous beauty from Paris, the woman who had somehow captured an Egyptian prince. She savored that word, captured. It suggested power, control, agency. It almost made her forget that every crystal chandelier, every bottle of champagne, every moment of quiet deference belonged not to her, but to the man waiting in their suite. Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, her husband, her golden cage. The corridor opened into the riverside bar, where amber lamps softened the harsh lines of ambition etched into every face. Men glanced up as she passed, but their gazes lingered differently now than they had in her courtesan days. They looked not just at her beauty, but at what surrounded it: the diamonds, the suggestion of unlimited wealth, the aura of untouchability that money provided like expensive perfume. Desire had been transformed by her marriage from hunger into calculation, from want into envy. She caught her reflection in a gilt-framed mirror and studied the woman looking back. Dark hair set in fashionable waves, lips painted deep crimson, pearls sewn into her bodice like captured stars. If she narrowed her eyes just slightly, she could almost erase the girl she had been, Margot from the working-class streets of Paris, daughter of a taxi driver and a seamstress, sent to work at 13 and cast out at 16, when her condition became an embarrassment to be hidden away. But Paris lived beneath her skin like a scar that never fully healed. The stench of cheap wine in narrow alleys, the desperate breath of men who believed their coins bought them pieces of her soul. The madame's voice, sharp as broken glass, instructing her to smile always, because a pleasing expression was a woman's most valuable weapon. Even wrapped in silk and married to a prince, that voice whispered its eternal warning: this can disappear. They can send you back. The Savoy represented everything she had once pressed her face against shop windows to glimpse. As a child, she had followed elegant carriages through the rain-soaked streets of Paris, letting their wheels spray her threadbare skirts with mud, just to feel closer to that unreachable world. It had not been simple envy that took root in her young heart. It was something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating decision that if the world worshipped money, she would become whatever money desired most. And she had succeeded through careful study and ruthless application. She learned that wealthy men were lonely in ways that could be exploited, that powerful figures whispered their most dangerous secrets in bed, that information gathered patiently could prove as valuable as any jewel. A duke here, a racing magnate there, a young officer whose indiscreet letters she still kept, locked away in a safety deposit box. Each relationship had been a stepping stone, lifting her higher above the filth of her origins. The apartment on Avenue Hoshi had been her first real victory. Then came the horses, the gowns from Worth, the invitations to the most exclusive salons in Europe. With each conquest, she told herself the same promise: never again, never poor, never powerless, never dependent on anyone's charity or whim. Then Ali had appeared at the casino in Deauville, young and uncertain despite his vast inheritance, surrounded by an entourage that couldn't quite mask his fundamental insecurity. She had recognized something in his eager eyes that she had seen in so many men before: the desperate need to possess something beautiful, something that would prove his worth to a world that questioned it. When she learned the true extent of his Egyptian cotton fortune, when she heard whispers of palaces along the Nile and connections to former royalty, she had seen her final transformation, from courtesan to princess, from temporary acquisition to permanent position. Now, walking through the Savoy toward Suite 41, she felt the weight of the wedding ring on her finger like a shackle disguised as jewelry. The marriage contract that had promised her security. The Egyptian laws that had given her husband complete control over her movements, her money, her very existence. The gradual realization that she had not married a man but entered into ownership by one. From behind their door came the sound of raised voices, Ali's fury unleashed in rapid Arabic before switching to French for her benefit. A chair scraped against the floor. Crystal chimed against wood with dangerous force. Her maid hesitated. "Madam, you may go," Marguerite said quietly, never taking her eyes from the door. "Leave the rap." The girl's footsteps faded down the corridor, absorbed by those sounds swallowing carpets, leaving Marguerite alone with the growing storm behind the door marked 41. She pressed her palm against the cool wood and felt the vibration of his rage through the barrier. How fragile wealth truly was, she thought. It sparkled like the crystal in those chandeliers, magnificent, dazzling, yet a single crack could shatter everything into worthless fragments. And when the glittering pieces fell, what remained? A girl from the Paris slums, exposed and defenseless. Inside the suite, her name exploded from Ali's lips like a curse: Marguerite. She smiled to herself, a slow, deliberate expression that held no warmth. For a woman who had clawed her way up from nothing, there were limits to what she would allow herself to lose. She had survived the gutters, the brothels, the casual cruelty of men who believed their money bought them the right to destroy her. She had not come this far to be broken now. She turned the handle and stepped into the room, not yet knowing that before this night ended, the newspapers would have a new name for her. Not Marguerite the courtesan, not Princess Fami, but something far more dangerous and permanent: the woman who got away with murder. Chapter 2, 15 March 1919, Saturday, Avenue Hoche, Paris. Moving back in time, this chapter chronicles Marguerite's transformation from a discarded girl to one of Paris's most expensive courtesans. After an early, loveless marriage ends in abandonment, she is taken in by a sophisticated brothel, where she learns to craft herself into a luxury commodity. The chapter explores how she studied wealthy men's psychology, learning their appetites and vulnerabilities while consciously constructing her persona. We witness her acquisition of the Avenue Hoche apartment, the furs and racehorses that marked her ascent, and the calculated relationships that funded her new life. Yet beneath the gloss lies constant strain. Her relationships are purely transactional, her friendships brittle as spun glass. A crisis emerges when a powerful lover betrays her, withdrawing promised financial security and reminding her that even among the wealthy, women like her remain disposable. An unexpected pregnancy and subsequent loss deepen the cracks in her carefully constructed armor. As post-war Paris begins to glitter with new possibilities in 1919, Marguerite realizes that beauty fades and influence evaporates. She must secure something permanent, a marriage, a title, a fortune that cannot be withdrawn on a whim. The chapter ends with her first glimpse of Ali Fahmy, setting the stage for her ultimate gamble. Paris in the spring of 1919 wore its sins like jewelry, bright and shameless in the aftermath of war. The city had survived the German guns, and now it celebrated with the desperate intensity of those who had looked death in the face and lived to tell the tale. From her balcony on the Avenue Hoche, Marguerite watched the parade of opportunity below, polished automobiles carrying men with new fortunes, women in revolutionary short skirts, the whole machinery of pleasure grinding back to life after 4 years of enforced sobriety. She leaned against the wrought iron railing, her silk morning robe loose at the waist, knowing that any man who glanced upward would see only a suggestion, a silhouette that allowed him to project his own fantasies. Suggestion had always been her greatest weapon. It permitted them to imagine she was whatever they needed her to be. The apartment behind her was a testament to careful calculation disguised as effortless taste. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every crystal decanter had been selected to create an atmosphere of refined sensuality. This was not the gaudy opulence of nouveau riche vulgarity, but something more subtle and infinitely more expensive. The suggestion that money was so abundant it need not be displayed, only felt. Her maid entered with the morning correspondence on a silver tray. Among the usual invitations and bills lay a letter that made Marguerite's carefully controlled expression flicker for just a moment. She recognized the heavy paper, the aristocratic seal, the handwriting of the English duke who had spoken so eloquently of providing for her future. She opened it with one lacquered nail, reading the familiar litany of regret and circumstance. A reconciliation with his wife. Changed financial situations. Gratitude for their friendship. A modest sum enclosed as a farewell gesture. The money on the tray, francs, pounds, the currencies of temporary affection, suddenly seemed pitifully small. She did not allow herself to sit, because sitting would acknowledge the blow. Instead, she moved to her vanity and studied her reflection with the clinical assessment of a jeweler, examining a stone for flaws. At 29, she was at the peak of her power. The war had eliminated much of her competition. Some had married hastily. Others had faded into provincial obscurity. Still others had simply disappeared into the vast machinery of death that had consumed Europe. Marguerite had survived by being more than beautiful, more than skilled in the arts that men paid for. She had made herself indispensable through her understanding of masculine psychology, her ability to become whatever fantasy they required. But the Duke's letter was a reminder of the one variable she could not control: time. Behind her reflection, she could see the ghost of the 17-year-old girl who had been locked away when her pregnancy became visible, then abandoned to institutions that specialized in making inconvenient problems disappear. The memory of that child, lost before she could even hold it, remained a wound that never quite healed. The first brothel had been a finishing school of sorts, though not the kind respectable families acknowledged. The madam had been a woman of surprising refinement, someone who understood that the wealthiest clients paid not just for physical pleasure, but for the illusion of sophistication, for the fantasy that their desires were elevated above mere animal need. "You have potential," the woman had told her, circling like a buyer at an art auction. But potential is worthless without cultivation. Men of quality don't want a pretty peasant girl. They want a work of art that happens to be available for private viewing. Marguerite had learned. She had studied languages, literature, the subtle arts of conversation that could make a man feel brilliant while revealing his weaknesses. She had learned to read the financial pages, to understand the difference between old money and new, to recognize the particular hungers of power. Most importantly, she had learned to make each man believe he was the exception, the one who had discovered her true self beneath the professional facade. The apartment on Avenue Hoshi had been her graduation present to herself, purchased with the carefully accumulated gifts of 3 years' worth of admirers. Each room represented a different conquest: the Venetian mirror from a shipping magnate, the Persian carpets from a government minister, the stable of racehorses from a young officer whose letters she kept locked in a safety deposit box. But as she stood in her silk robe reading the Duke's dismissal, Marguerite faced the fundamental uncertainty that haunted every woman in her position. All of her wealth, all of her security, depended on the continued desire and discretion of men who viewed her as a luxury they might choose to forgo at any moment. The pregnancy 2 years earlier had been a miscalculation that nearly destroyed everything. Not the physical fact of it, such things could be managed, but the emotional vulnerability it had revealed. For a few weeks, she had allowed herself to imagine a different life, a child who might love her without transaction. The loss had been devastating, not just for what it took away, but for what it revealed about the emptiness at the center of her carefully constructed existence. That evening, at the casino in Deauville, she had been studying the room with the predatory attention of a hunter when the proprietor approached with his deferential smile. "Madam," he had murmured, "permit me to introduce a very distinguished guest. Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, from Cairo." She turned, already assembling the expression she knew such men enjoyed: curiosity mixed with respect, warmth tempered by just enough reserve to suggest she was not easily impressed. The young man who stood before her was handsome in an uncertain way, his clothes impeccable, but his posture betraying the insecurity of someone unused to being the center of attention, without the buffer of inherited authority. Their eyes met, and in his gaze she recognized something she had seen countless times before: the desperate need of a man who had everything except confidence in his own worth. He was younger than her, barely 22, with the soft features of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. "Your Highness," she said in carefully accented French, extending her hand. "Paris is honored by your presence." He held her hand longer than propriety required, his breathing slightly accelerated, his pupils dilated despite the bright lights of the casino. She recognized the moment he decided he must possess her, the instant when want became obsession. As they spoke, about Paris, about Egypt, about the fascinating complexity of a world emerging from war, Marguerite felt the familiar thrill of a successful hunt beginning. But beneath the professional satisfaction lay something more urgent. She was approaching 30. Beauty was a depreciating asset. The skills that had served her so well were becoming obsolete in a world that increasingly prized youth over sophistication. What she needed was not another protector who might tire of her, but something permanent: a marriage, a title, a fortune that could not be withdrawn on a whim or a wife's suspicious inquiry. By the time Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey asked if he might call on her in Paris, Marguerite had already begun to envision herself not as his mistress, but as his wife, not as a temporary acquisition, but as a permanent investment in her own security. She agreed to dinner with the smile that had launched a dozen affairs and ended twice as many marriages, never suspecting that this particular gamble would end not in security, but in gunpowder and blood on the carpets of the Savoy Hotel. Chapter 3, 1st July 1923, Sunday, Gezira Palace, Cairo. Now married to Prince Ali Fahmy, Marguerite discovers that Egyptian wealth comes with cultural chains she never anticipated. At the Gezira Palace, she confronts a world where her European sophistication means nothing, where she is viewed with suspicion by Ali's family and Egyptian society. The chapter chronicles the gradual deterioration of their marriage as Ali's initial infatuation transforms into possessive control. His behavior shifts from romantic devotion to systematic psychological torture, fueled by jealousy over her past and insecurity about his own position in post-colonial Egypt. Marguerite, accustomed to managing men through charm and manipulation, finds herself powerless against someone who views her as property rather than a person. The crisis escalates when Ali threatens to rewrite his will, potentially leaving her with nothing, while publicly humiliating her about her courtesan past. A violent confrontation in front of servants marks the point where Marguerite realizes escape through conventional means is impossible. The chapter builds relentless tension through the oppressive heat, the isolation, and Ali's increasingly erratic behavior. It ends with his announcement of a trip to London, where he plans to formalize her disinheritance, forcing Marguerite to confront the possibility that her survival may require the ultimate gamble. The heat in Cairo was not merely temperature. It was a living thing that pressed against the lungs and settled in the bones like a fever that would not break. From the marble terrace of the Gezira Palace, Marguerite stared across the Nile toward the ancient city, watching feluccas drift like white moths against the muddy water. 6 months had passed since her wedding, and she was beginning to understand that she had not married into wealth so much as been absorbed by it, dissolved into something larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The palace itself was a monument to the kind of power that Europeans could barely comprehend. Built during the reign of Khedive Ismail, it sprawled along the riverbank like a small city, its gardens filled with rare orchids, and its halls lined with carpets that had taken years to weave. This was not the nouveau riche ostentation of Parisian society, but something far older and more implacable, wealth that had been accumulating for generations, that carried with it the weight of tradition and the expectation of absolute obedience. Ali had been different in Egypt from the uncertain young man she had charmed in Deauville. Here, surrounded by the symbols of his inheritance and the deference of servants who had known his family for decades, he had transformed into something she had not anticipated. The boy prince who had blushed at her smiles had been replaced by a man who expected her complete submission as his natural right. The warning signs had been there from their first week in Cairo. The way he dismissed her opinions in front of his business associates, the casual violence with which he struck a servant who had been too slow with his coffee, the locked rooms in the palace that she was forbidden to enter, and the questions that met any inquiry about his activities with cold stares and abrupt changes of subject. But it was the women who had taught her the true nature of her situation. Ali's female relatives, draped in silk and gold, had received her with the kind of polite hostility reserved for foreign curiosities. They spoke to her in Arabic, then translated their words into French with smiles that never reached their eyes. She was the European wife, the former courtesan who had somehow ensnared their prince, and they would never let her forget the precariousness of her position. You must understand, Ali's aunt had told her during a formal tea ceremony that marriage in Egypt is not the same as in your France. Here, a wife's position depends entirely on her husband's pleasure. If she displeases him, the woman had shrugged, a gesture that contained volumes of unspoken threat. Marguerite had tried to apply the skills that had served her so well in Paris, but they were useless in this context. The charm that had captivated European men fell flat against Ali's growing conviction that she belonged to him completely. The intelligence that had allowed her to manipulate powerful figures was dismissed as unwomanly interference. The independence that had been her greatest asset became, in Ali's eyes, evidence of her fundamental unsuitability as a wife. The violence had begun subtly, a grip on her wrist that left bruises, a shove that sent her stumbling, a slap delivered so quickly that she almost convinced herself it had been accidental. But as the months passed, Ali's control over his temper deteriorated along with his respect for her autonomy. He read her correspondence, monitored her movements, and made it clear that she existed solely for his pleasure and convenience. The sexual aspect of their marriage became a form of systematic humiliation. Ali's appetites were not merely demanding, but deliberately degrading, designed to reinforce her powerlessness. What had been her profession in Paris, the skilled management of masculine desire, became torture in Cairo. She could not refuse, could not negotiate, could not maintain the emotional distance that had protected her during her years as a courtesan. By June, Marguerite was planning escape with the desperation of a prisoner. She wrote carefully coded letters to friends in Paris, hoarded small amounts of money, and cultivated relationships with the few Europeans who showed her sympathy. But every plan seemed impossible. Ali controlled her passport, her finances, her very identity. Egyptian law gave husbands absolute authority over their wives. Even if she reached the French consulate, what could they do? She was legally married, and her husband had committed no crime that would warrant diplomatic intervention. The crisis came on a blazing afternoon when the temperature reached 115 degrees and tempers throughout the city had been stretched to breaking point. Ali had returned from a meeting with British cotton buyers in a foul mood, his pride wounded by some perceived slight. He found Marguerite in the library, reading a French novel, and his rage exploded with terrifying suddenness. "You think you are better than us," he screamed, knocking the book from her hands. "You sit here with your European books, your European thoughts, looking down on everything Egyptian. You forget what you were before I made you a princess." The words that followed were designed to destroy whatever remained of her dignity. He detailed her past with clinical precision, describing her former clients, her methods, her prices. He told her that he had investigated her thoroughly before their marriage, that he knew exactly what kind of woman he had purchased. "Without me, you are nothing," he concluded, his face inches from hers. "A used-up whore that no man would want. I can send you back to Paris tomorrow, and every door will be closed to you. Or I can keep you here, and you will learn to be grateful for whatever I choose to give you." The physical blow that followed sent her crashing into a bookshelf, volumes cascading around her as she fell. But it was not the violence that broke something inside her. It was the laughter of the servant who had witnessed the scene, a sound that told her she had no allies, no protection, no hope of rescue from anyone in this palace. That evening, as she sat in her room applying powder to hide the bruises on her face, Ali appeared in the doorway with a document in his hand. It was a new will, he explained, one that would ensure she received only what Egyptian law required, a pittance compared to what she had been promised. "You will sign this," he said, placing the papers on her dressing table. "And you will be grateful that I am being so generous to a woman who has brought me nothing but embarrassment." Marguerite stared at the document that would reduce her to beggary, at the man who had transformed from suitor to owner to executioner. In that moment, she understood that conventional escape was impossible. Ali would never divorce her. She was too useful as a target for his frustrations. He would never let her leave. She knew too much about his business affairs and personal habits. Her only choices were submission or something far more desperate. "We will go to London next month," Ali announced, as if conferring a favor. "I have business there, and you can see your precious Europe one more time before we settle this matter permanently." London. The word lodged in her mind like a seed. In London, there would be English law, English newspapers, English juries, who might understand the situation of a European woman trapped in an impossible marriage. In London, there might be possibilities that did not exist in the suffocating heat of Cairo. As Ali left her room, locking the door behind him with the casual authority of a jailer, Marguerite walked to her window and stared out at the Nile. The ancient river flowed indifferently toward the Mediterranean, carrying the silt of centuries toward the sea. She pressed her palm against the glass and felt the heat radiating through it like the breath of a furnace. In 3 weeks, they would be in London. In 3 weeks, she would either find a way to free herself from this nightmare, or she would disappear into it forever. The woman who had survived the gutters of Paris, who had transformed herself from a coachman's daughter into a princess, was about to face the greatest test of her life. She did not yet know that the test would be measured not in cunning or charm, but in gunpowder and blood. Chapter 4, 10 July 1923, Tuesday, the Savoy Hotel, London. The narrative reaches its climax during the sweltering London heatwave as Marguerite and Ali's toxic relationship explodes into its final, fatal confrontation. Confined to Suite 41 at the Savoy, their marriage becomes a pressure cooker of violence, humiliation, and desperation. The chapter alternates between scenes of escalating brutality and Marguerite's internal calculation as she realizes that conventional escape routes have been exhausted. Ali's behavior reaches new levels of cruelty, including public humiliation and explicit threats of murder. The oppressive heat mirrors the rising tension as Marguerite confronts the reality that she has become trapped, not just legally and financially, but physically. A violent scene witnessed by hotel staff marks the point where her situation becomes untenable. The chapter builds relentless suspense through detailed psychological exploration of Marguerite's mental state as she moves from victim to someone contemplating the unthinkable. The climax occurs in the early hours of July 10, when a final confrontation in their suite ends with 3 gunshots echoing through the Savoy's corridors. The chapter ends with the immediate aftermath: Ali's body on the carpet, Marguerite standing with the smoking pistol, and the sound of running footsteps as hotel staff rush toward Suite 41. London was drowning in heat. The summer of 1923 had brought temperatures that turned the city into a furnace, buckling pavement and fraying nerves throughout the metropolis. At the Savoy Hotel, even the thick walls and marble floors could not provide relief from the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press against the windows like a living thing seeking entry. In Suite 41, the heat had become another weapon in the war between Marguerite and Ali Fahmy. For 3 weeks, their marriage had been disintegrating in the most public way possible, their arguments echoing through corridors, their scenes witnessed by increasingly concerned staff. The elegant suite that should have been a sanctuary had become a battlefield where every conversation was a skirmish and every silence was loaded with threat. Marguerite stood at the window overlooking the Thames, watching the sluggish water reflect the copper glare of the setting sun. Her white evening dress clung to her skin, damp with perspiration that had nothing to do with the temperature. Behind her, Ali paced the sitting room like a caged animal, his movements sharp with barely contained violence. The evening had begun badly and deteriorated from there. At dinner in the Savoy's restaurant, Ali had subjected her to a calculated campaign of humiliation, speaking loudly enough for other diners to hear as he detailed his plans to divorce her and leave her with nothing. He had described her past with clinical precision, using words designed to destroy whatever remained of her reputation among the international set that frequented the hotel. "Everyone knows what you were," he had hissed over the soup course, his voice carrying to the neighboring tables. "A French whore who thought she could trap an Egyptian prince. When I am finished with you, no decent person will receive you anywhere in Europe." The other diners had pretended not to hear, but Marguerite had seen the sideways glances, the whispered conversations, the way conversations died when she passed. Her humiliation was becoming entertainment for people who had once courted her favor. Now, back in their suite, Ali's mood had shifted from cold cruelty to manic excitement. He had been drinking heavily, but his intoxication seemed to sharpen rather than dull his capacity for inflicting pain. He pulled out a revolver, one of several firearms he carried as affectations of power, and began cleaning it with exaggerated care. "You know what this is for?" he asked, holding up the weapon so the light caught its polished surface. In Egypt, when a man's honor is damaged by his wife, he has the right to restore it. English law is more delicate, but accidents happen, even in the best hotels. The threat was explicit, delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. Marguerite felt something cold settle in her stomach, a recognition that she had moved beyond the realm of marital discord into something far more dangerous. She had tried everything. Letters to lawyers had been intercepted and destroyed. Attempts to contact friends in Paris had been blocked. Even her efforts to seek help from the hotel management had been dismissed. Ali was a prince, a wealthy guest whose comfort took precedence over the complaints of his wife. The British authorities had no interest in interfering in what they saw as a domestic matter between foreigners. The realization that she was completely alone, completely trapped, had been settling over her for days like a fog. But tonight, watching Ali caress his revolver while describing in detail how he would kill her and claim self-defense, she understood that the situation had moved beyond entrapment into immediate physical danger. "You think your English friends will protect you?" Ali continued, his voice rising. "You think your letters to the Prince of Wales mean anything now? I will tell them all what you really are. I will show them the photographs I have of you, the documents that prove how many men you serviced before you trapped me." The mention of photographs sent ice through her veins. She had no idea what evidence he might possess, what documentation of her past might exist. The thought of her former life being displayed for the amusement of British society, of becoming a public spectacle, was almost worse than the threat of physical violence. Ali stood up suddenly, swaying slightly from the alcohol, and advanced toward her with the revolver still in his hand. His eyes had the unfocused intensity of someone whose grip on reality was slipping, whose capacity for rational thought had been overwhelmed by rage and wounded pride. "Tonight," he said, reaching for her with his free hand, "I will teach you what happens to women who forget their place, and if you scream, if you try to run, I will use this." He grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into the flesh with enough force to leave marks. Marguerite tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. The revolver swung wildly as he struggled to maintain his hold on both her and the weapon. "Let me go," she gasped, genuinely frightened now by the look in his eyes. "Ali, you're drunk. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," he snarled, dragging her toward the bedroom. "I'm taking back what belongs to me. What happened next would be debated in courtrooms and newspapers for months to come." In her own mind, Marguerite would replay those moments countless times, trying to understand the precise sequence of events that transformed her from victim to killer in the space of a few heartbeats. She remembered breaking free from his grip and stumbling backward into the bedroom. She remembered the small automatic pistol she had purchased weeks earlier, telling herself it was for protection, though she had never clearly defined protection from what. She remembered Ali following her, still holding his revolver, his face twisted with an expression she had never seen before, not just anger, but something approaching madness. "You want to play with guns?" He had screamed, raising his weapon. "Let me show you how it's done." The first shot came from her pistol, fired more from instinct than intention as Ali lunged toward her. The sound was impossibly loud in the confined space, followed immediately by the crash of his body hitting the floor. But he was still moving, still trying to raise his revolver, and she fired again. And again. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey lay motionless on the carpet of Suite 41, blood spreading in a dark pool beneath his body. The smell of cordite hung in the air like incense in a church. Marguerite stood over him, the smoking pistol still in her hand, her white dress spattered with his blood. From the corridor came the sound of running footsteps, raised voices, the mechanical response of a hotel trained to handle crises. But for Marguerite, standing in that room with the man who had been her husband, her tormentor, her golden cage, there was only the terrible recognition that her old life had ended and something entirely new and terrifying was about to begin. The door burst open, admitting hotel staff whose faces registered shock, horror, and the immediate calculation of how to manage a scandal that would dominate headlines around the world. But Marguerite barely saw them. She was staring at Ali's body, at the blood on her hands, at the weapon that had transformed her from victim to something else entirely. She had gotten away with murder, but the getting away was just beginning. Chapter 5, 11 September 1923, Tuesday, Old Bailey, London. The final chapter unfolds in the courtroom where Marguerite stands trial for murder, transforming from private tragedy to public spectacle. The trial becomes a sensation, with newspapers publishing every detail in society divided between those who see her as a murderess and those who view her as a victim of Oriental brutality. Her defense team, led by Sir Edward Marshall Hall, constructs a masterful narrative that plays on British prejudices about foreign men and protective instincts toward European womanhood. Marguerite must perform the greatest role of her life, the helpless victim driven to desperate measures by an abusive husband. The chapter explores the psychological complexity of her position as she manipulates public sympathy while genuinely traumatized by her experiences. Through courtroom scenes, we witness how her skills as a courtesan serve her well in the dock, as she embodies innocence and suffering for a jury predisposed to protect white women from dark foreign threats. The verdict of not guilty brings freedom, but not redemption. The final scenes show Marguerite years later, living quietly in Paris, haunted by memories and isolated by notoriety. She achieved what she sought, survival, but at the cost of any possibility of genuine human connection, leaving her trapped in the amber of her own scandalous legend. The Old Bailey in September was a theater of justice, where truth mattered less than performance, and Marguerite Alibert was giving the performance of her life. Dressed in unrelieved black, her face pale beneath a mourning veil, she sat in the dock like a broken bird, her shoulders curved inward as if protecting herself from invisible blows. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, every seat filled with spectators who had queued for hours to witness the trial of the century. She had become a sensation. The newspapers called her the tragic princess, the beautiful killer, the woman who shot a prince. Her story had everything the British public craved: exotic wealth, sexual scandal, violence, and the eternal question of whether a woman could be both victim and murderess. The press gallery buzzed with journalists from around the world, their pencils poised to record every gesture, every tear, every word that fell from her lips. The prosecution painted her as a calculating gold digger who had married for money and killed when the arrangement soured. They spoke of her past as a courtesan, her knowledge of firearms, her deliberate purchase of the pistol that had ended Ali's life. Each accusation was a lash that stripped away another layer of the dignity she had spent years constructing. But Sir Edward Marshall Hall, the great defender, understood that trials were won not with facts, but with stories that resonated in the hearts of 12 middle-class Englishmen. He rose to address the jury like an actor taking center stage, his voice filling the courtroom with righteous indignation. "Gentlemen of the jury," he thundered, gesturing toward the weeping figure in the dock, "before you sits not a murderess, but a victim. A woman driven beyond the bounds of human endurance by a man whose Eastern passions knew no limit, whose cruelty was matched only by his contempt for the civilization that had educated him." Hall painted Ali Kamal Fahmy Bey not as a husband but as a monster, a product of Oriental decadence who had subjected a refined European woman to unspeakable degradations. He used the prejudices of 1920s Britain as his palette, creating a portrait that played on every fear and assumption his audience harbored about foreign men and their treatment of women. The evidence he presented was devastating in its intimacy. Medical testimony about the bruises on Marguerite's body, witness accounts from Savoy staff who had heard the arguments, seen the violence, observed Ali's erratic behavior. Letters in which Ali had threatened her life, describing in explicit detail what he would do to her if she tried to leave him. But it was Marguerite's own testimony that sealed her fate, or rather, her freedom. She took the witness stand like a woman walking to her execution, her voice barely above a whisper as she recounted the nightmare of her marriage. She described the isolation in Cairo, the systematic destruction of her independence, the sexual humiliation that had been disguised as marital rights. "He told me he would kill me," she sobbed, her French accent making her words seem even more vulnerable in the English courtroom. "He said no one would care about a French whore who had forgotten her place. He said he would make me disappear, and everyone would believe whatever story he chose to tell." The jury watched her with the protective instincts of men raised to see themselves as defenders of feminine virtue. She was beautiful, foreign, and helpless, everything their culture had taught them to shield from harm. When she described the final night, the revolver in Ali's hand, his threats to kill her, her desperate grab for the pistol that represented her only hope of survival, several jurors were openly weeping. "I did not mean to kill him," she whispered, her voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine anguish. "I only wanted him to stop. I only wanted to live." The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal, but ultimately ineffective. Yes, she had been a courtesan. Yes, she had married Ali for his money. Yes, she had purchased the pistol weeks before the shooting. But Hall had crafted a narrative so compelling, so perfectly calibrated to British sensibilities, that facts seemed irrelevant beside the emotional truth of a woman's desperate fight for survival. When the jury returned after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the foreman's voice rang out clear and certain: "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted in applause. Women wept with joy. Reporters rushed for the doors to file their stories. Marguerite collapsed in the dock, overwhelmed by what appeared to be relief, but was actually something more complex: the recognition that she had won her life, but lost something equally precious in the process. The trial had made her notorious in ways that transcended mere scandal. She was no longer Marguerite Alibert, the clever courtesan who had charmed princes and kings. She was the woman who got away with murder, a figure of legend and speculation who would never again be able to move through the world without carrying that identity like a brand. Years later, in a small apartment in Paris, an elderly woman would sit by her window, watching the city she had once conquered. The newspapers had moved on to other scandals, other tragedies. The public that had once hung on her every word had forgotten her existence. But Marguerite remembered everything: the weight of the pistol in her hand, the sound of Ali's body hitting the floor, the taste of freedom that had turned to ash in her mouth. She had achieved what she had always sought: survival. She had escaped poverty, violence, and the hangman's noose through a combination of cunning, performance, and sheer determination. But the price had been higher than she had ever imagined. The woman who had spent her life becoming whatever men desired had finally become something that no one could love. A legend, a cautionary tale, a ghost haunting the margins of a world that had once worshipped her. In the end, perhaps that was the cruelest irony of all. Marguerite Alibert had gotten away with murder, but she had not escaped the consequences of a life built on deception and survival. She had won her freedom, but lost her soul. She had cheated death, but not the slow dissolution of a spirit that had sacrificed everything authentic about itself in the pursuit of security. The woman who died in 1971, largely forgotten by a world that had moved on to newer scandals, was both victor and victim of her own extraordinary will to survive. She had proven that a woman could rise from nothing, could transform herself into anything, could even kill and walk free if she understood the rules well enough to break them successfully. But she had also proven that some victories are indistinguishable from defeat, and some escapes are merely different forms of imprisonment. The scandalous life of Marguerite Alibert was, in the end, a testament to the terrible price of getting exactly what you think you want.